Okay, I'm Christy Carson, and today I'm here with Sarah McCourt, and I'm going to ask her a few questions about teaching online. And she comes from an acting background as well as a teaching background, so I think that's going to be really useful to us. So I'm just going to ask Sarah if you'd just introduce yourself briefly and the kind of teaching that you've been doing.
Thank you. Yes, I've been a senior lecturer and programme leader at Marjon University. I've been leading up the acting, musical theatre and performing arts education programmes. So obviously moving online has been really challenging to be teaching what are quite practical courses and training students for going out into the profession.
Absolutely. So I'm trying something that I haven't done before, which is actually putting up the question that on closed captioning. See if that works. So the first question is, did you teach online before the pandemic, or was that your first experience?
I didn't, and that, in a sense, now looking back, I'm thinking, why didn't we? And I think part of it is we've always, within the theatre area, we've always kind of resisted a little bit the moving online, partly because it's such a tactile craft. It's something where, you know, students tend to be very kinesthetic learners, and so it's that thing of being in the studio together and learning and that live experience. Although I think my opinion has changed subsequently, and I'm starting to see that there's benefits that we could move forward with from working online as well.
Well, this is why I think this is a really important moment to sort of capture people's attitudes, because, as I say, I've been an advocate of this kind of teaching, but it's all happened so quickly that I don't think people have had time to really think about both the positive things and the negative things that have come out of it. So before the pandemic and before you were teaching online, did you use digital resources in the classroom at all?
Well, yes, I've always used PowerPoint, and I think part of practice is often when we're working in rehearsals, particularly if you're working with, for example, something like physical theatre, it's quite useful to keep a record. So there's that sense of keeping a record and having uploading routines after you've sort of learned a dance routine, or uploading some of the day's work to have a look at afterwards and think, oh yes, I'm going to pick this out, or I'm going to pick that out. And also we've been moving very much towards students being able to keep interactive performance logs, so using edublogs. So of course students then could be working on record a little bit of their rehearsal and put that into their edublog and reflect directly upon it. So we've been trying to kind of move towards a more digital approach.
Well, I think that's what's so interesting about all of this is that we have, it's been an evolution. And as I say, I've been involved with it for quite a long time, but it's suddenly got this, huge push forward. And I think some things have sort of broken through a barrier of resistance within the universities, and also within people's, own feeling about it. So what has changed in terms of your teaching practice, in terms of the online environment?
Um, I think probably going right back to the first lockdown, it was so quick. And I think that left us all very much, how does this happen? And being creative, it became a creative challenge. So I think one of the biggest things that we had to face was our third years were going into their final showcase, which is directed by a visiting director. It tours nationally. They end up with their showcase in London, and they invite agents. And it was right at the beginning of the process. They had just met their artistic director for that show, and that suddenly we're in lockdown a week in, and we were all scratching our heads going, how do we do this? And really fortunately we had a fantastic technician, and he'd actually seen the same show that I'd seen, which was The Show Must Go Online, where they've been putting on the Shakespeare shows, or they've gone through every single one. They're just about to do the last one in the first folio next week, which is The Tempest. And so we kind of both seen that. We've gone, maybe we can do it online. The director was really interested in doing it online. The designer was really happy to work with us. And what we actually did was Carol Churchill's Love and Information. And they very, very kindly negotiated a special performance rights deal for us so that we could do it. And the students, first off, I think they were a little bit concerned, but once they got working on it, they started to realize that there were possibilities. And that thing of being able to, once we'd sort of sent green screens out to everybody, the designer could then put up backdrops, and the students started to work with what is this medium? What does this mean? How do we work together as an ensemble? And that group had a really strong ensemble way of working already, and they were able to actually build on that. And the director worked so well with them that they produced a really excellent show, and as a result they actually got an international audience. So I think they ended up with a bigger audience than they would have done, and they all got agency offers on the back of that, because a lot of the agencies by that time had also gone online and realized that this was the only way they were going to recruit this year. So it actually ended up as being quite a flexible medium. So yes, they lost out on the experience of touring, and they felt that hard. On the other hand of that, they learnt an awful lot about presenting themselves online. They learnt they had to become their own technicians and learn about adjusting the camera, learn about putting up the green screen, setting everything up. And there's a kind of parallel, if you like, in the magic of what goes on behind an on-screen performance. So since that, I decided I really needed to have an experience of how do you do it yourself, because I learn by doing myself, I think, like a lot of the students do. So I got involved with The Show Must Go Online. So I've been involved in a couple of their productions, and there is quite an art to getting the camera lined up for the right shot. There's quite an art to passing things through the screen, which reminds me enormously of Forkbeard Fantasies work. And of course they were working in this sort of area, albeit not on Zoom, sort of 20 years ago. So it's sort of taking me back to some of their techniques. And that whole thing of being able to manage all of that and almost become their own stage managers within their space was quite important.
Well, I think you're hitting on something that's really been effective for, or an issue for a lot of teachers, is that they've had to manage their own environments and do it from home and become their own stage managers as well. And so, yeah, absolutely. We're all learning a huge amount. And I think it's quite tiring, but it's also, as you say, really empowering at the same time. So my next question really is, have any unexpected things come out of this experience?
I think there's a couple of unexpected things. I think the first one, in terms of staff meetings, is quite interesting. Is I've had Teams for a while, but I've never used it to have face-to-face meetings. I've always used it for, you know, sort of pinging messages and sharing documents. And I think, because you're often working in an environment where you have a lot of visiting lecturers, you have a lot of part-time staff, and there's that thing of trying to get everybody together at a time in a space to have a meeting. And actually now there's that wonderful thing of you can get together with people wherever they are in the country, or even in the world, and have a meeting, and it saves travel time. It saves, you know, you can have a really effective meeting very quickly with lots and lots of people. And I think that's something moving forward that has been a surprise. I think the surprise was that we'd never thought of doing it before.
Absolutely. And also I think that other people have said, you don't waste half the day or the entire day on an hour-long meeting, you know, because of parking and all the other issues and all the other things you get caught up in. Walking down the hall and chatting with people, things focus down on the meeting itself and what you're actually trying to achieve. And so I think a lot of people are realizing that a lot of their energies are getting sort of dissipated. In terms of
a big difference as well, because it means that you can go forward, and like if you're based in Plymouth, moving forward to sort of going to other conferences, to meeting with lecturers that are at the other end of the country, it allows you to feel a little bit less isolated, because being in the southwest, sometimes you can feel you have to travel 3 or 4 hours to get anywhere. So it's quite that makes quite a difference, I think, in terms of being able to share practice.
Well, and not just within the country, but across oceans as well. I know a number of people who have been zooming into each other's classes in ways that they never would have if they had to, arrange for expenses and travel. If they can just sit down in their office and do an hour in another country. I have a friend in Australia who is zooming into some work at the Shakespeare Institute. So again, there's lots of ways I think that things have been enriched by this environment. So what would you say are the positive outcomes of online learning or blended learning, I think is the other thing that we're getting more of?
There's a few. I think the biggest one that came out of that first project that we did with the third years was learning about managing space. We've had to become a lot more aware of that. And in a sense, I did a little bit of research with those students, did some interviews with those students. And because Zoom is quite a tiring platform to focus in on.
Really tiring.
And so that sense of making every moment in the rehearsal room count, or every moment in the lecture count, so that you're not wasting time. People are actually coming prepared and working almost in a more professional way. There's no little bit around the edges where there's a little bit of conversation. People are coming to work because they want to focus for that short amount of time, rather than kind of dragging it out. It's not somewhere where people want to spend a long time socializing afterwards. So students are coming prepared. We spent a lot of time, well, I certainly spent a lot of time when I was starting to teach professional profile, and that's quite interesting because that module deals with getting students ready to go straight into the profession. So we're looking at self-tapes, we're looking at headshots, we're looking at audition practices. And of course, more and more auditions are occurring online right now. Mm-hmm. So it's the ideal format, in a sense, for teaching students how to deal with online interviews. So some of the first things that we looked at was how to set up your space, how to set up your lighting, how to present yourself on camera, how to manage the camera, all of that side of things. And what that actually came out of partly was the research that I did with the third years at the end of their performance, which was about the importance of setting up a performance space so that they come into the rehearsal or they come into the lecture with their head very much into that professional space. And of course, that's something that we do automatically, we teach when it comes to going into the rehearsal room, but to be teaching it for online, we're also having to think about giving relevant breaks, thinking a little bit more about how you set up your lighting, how you set up your space. But I think that's really helped the students to manage their feelings. You know, if you're sitting at home all day, your mental health, if you're at home all day learning online, and it's the same room that you sleep in, the same room that you study in. So we've been able to talk a lot about health and that idea of having the window open, having regular breaks, going for walks, using having a drink of water, and that thing of, if you set up your session, you set up your screen, I'm going to be working, and then at the end of the session you break everything down again. It actually feels, it's a little bit like striking a set. It's like, okay, now in my head I'm still in the same room, but in a sense I've moved, it helps me to shift my thinking, it helps me to shift into a different mode so that I'm not stuck in, I'm still working on screen or I'm still in work mode. And I think that's been really useful for the students. A lot of them have kind of come back on that and sort of discussed that.
And I think you're right that the students in a way have always had a kind of less of a divide between the public and the private, I think, than those of us who came into the into teaching earlier. But as you're saying, what's happening professionally is those things are merging anyway. And so in a way, we're coming closer to the students, but we're also coming closer to the way things are being done professionally. So I think you're right. There's we're all learning, and that gap that I think was between, those of us of a certain age and the generation who grew up with this technology is coming closer together. Because I think a lot of people have said that they found that the students, as you say, are much more engaged. They also feel they're more part of it because the structures are being developed as you go forward. And so they're helping to, they know that the lecturers don't have all of the technical skills. And so they're engaging and trying to help in a way that I think coming into university or, higher education often is seen as sort of intimidating, and the students sit back and wait for things to come to them. But I think there are real advantages, I think, to this way of working. But what about drawbacks? Do you think that there are any drawbacks to this kind of interaction?
I think there's an area that we're still exploring in theatre. There's particularly the blended learning. So when you have students on camera and you have students in the rehearsal room, and that's actually, as a practitioner, quite exciting for me, because it allows us to start to say, hey, we're going to experiment with this. What happens with this form? And certainly going in the first few sessions, if you're doing something practical, it's like, I've not done this online. I don't know if this exercise is going to work online. Let's see what happens. How does this being online change it? How does the medium change it? So then when you're working in a blended learning environment and you're running exercises, you get slightly different results because it works differently. And I'm actually surprised how many of the acting techniques work so well actually on Zoom.
Okay, great.
And that's been a real discovery. But then to sort of be having students in the classroom and students on Zoom working on the same exercises and looking at what are the similarities and what are the differences is incredibly informing. But it's tiring and it's quite difficult because you've got that thing of, if somebody, when you're on Zoom, the students you can't talk over one another. And the students are great. They're really polite. And in a sense, they really think before they contribute something. Whereas in the classroom, students can talk more freely. And so managing that in feedback to make sure that there's a balance of contribution, and also making sure, because when we're using Zoom or we're using Teams, you've got the back channels so people can put information in chat. So making sure that you're getting information in 3 different ways from 3 different areas. And so managing the balance of that, I think, is challenging for the lecturer.
Absolutely. But I think it also highlights the things that we have privileged in the past. And as you say, being articulate, being able to put your thoughts together and, jump into a conversation, or having the confidence to jump into a conversation, are sometimes those students are not given the space. But then, as you say, there's the chat environment where a student who might be completely silent in a traditional classroom actually gets to say something. And it might be somebody else who goes, oh, wait a minute, somebody just mentioned something in the chat. So I think it's kind of, it upsets the normal hierarchies. And I think that's both, as you say, really tiring and actually kind of good for us to be forced to think about those things. So if we can think about a future when you actually get back into the classroom, do you think this experience will change your way of teaching?
I think so. I think there's, I think in a sense, what it's doing is it's allowing us to rethink what professionalism is. And I think for myself, I've realized how much of my own training I've relied on in terms of, and I've been grateful for, in terms of managing this as a professional environment, and sort of taking something of that back into the classroom, I think is really important, to sort of re-engage with students about what professionalism means and what that discipline actually allows you to do when you transfer it from one medium to another. I think we've always had Moodle, and we've always had that thing of putting up videos, putting up pre-reading, putting up questionnaires afterwards, and I've been using a lot of that alongside of online teaching. And I've been thinking a lot about how time seems to get squeezed quite a lot these days. And obviously with practical sessions, you want to kind of use the time as effectively as possible. So I think if anything, I'm thinking more about how can we use online more to allow us to sort of, in a sense, balance the time better, so that when you're in the classroom, when you're in the rehearsal room, that time really counts in the way that it does in a Zoom rehearsal, because nobody wants to hang around in a Zoom rehearsal and have the chit chat in quite the same way. And how do we kind of balance that with getting people to engage more with the Moodle resources, so that they come in with an offer. I think sometimes we don't expect the students to come in with an offer enough. And I think this is, for me, it's reset it and allowed me to kind of go, you come in with an offer. And that I think is kind of the value of it, making sure that students know how to do that and value that.
I think you're right. And I think that, preparation was something that we were allowing students to maybe do a little bit of, or do different things. But if you set very clear guidelines about what they have to prepare, I think that, as you say, you're going to get that engagement, and you're going to make the time really, really work for you. And, going back to what the students expect, if they're looking at value for money, which often is the case increasingly, you have a better sense yourself of what it is you are offering. So as you say, the professionalism part of it, I think, has many levels. So I've only got a couple, sorry.
I was going to say, and because they have chat rooms now, they've got used to using those breakout rooms. It's so easy now, because there's always been that thing of how do students get together if they're first year they're living in halls, it's a little bit easier, but when they live a long way away from the university, I think that's going to start coming into their practice more, because it's that thing of like, yes, booking rehearsal rooms, but rehearsal space is so closely booked, isn't it? And also when they leave, that thing of like being able to actually working online offers opportunities to run lines and practice things outside of the rehearsal room for free, so that when you come into the rehearsal room, some of the things that you might have done in the rehearsal room in the past, you've actually been able to do online beforehand very much more quickly.
Absolutely. And I think that whole idea of peer-to-peer learning is terribly important, but also creating a group of peers, because when you go out into the profession, those are the people that you will bump into again and again. And so, again, expecting the lecturer to do all the work doesn't acknowledge the fact that what they're there to do is to form communities and practices and people they want to work with, which again is going to, hopefully serve them really well in the future. So I guess I'm just going to ask you one more question, really, which is, if you had to give somebody who's just starting out with online learning one piece of advice, what would it be?
I would say, don't be afraid to acknowledge that you don't know, because that opens up a space to explore. And I think more and more, everybody out there is exploring. It is opening up so much in terms of collaboration across continents, so everybody has to start somewhere. A lot of the students, some students are really tech savvy, some students are not. So sometimes saying, I don't know how this is going to go, or I don't know how to do this, is a great way of actually opening things up to students. It's that thing of, in a sense, modeling failure, but failing well and saying, I don't know, let's give it a go. This is a safe environment, and we're all going to have a go and see how this goes, and what can we learn from that. And be prepared to learn more than you think you're going to.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing that, on the one hand, we were talking about professionalism. On the other hand, you don't have to have, perfect video. You don't have to have all the way bells and whistles to actually have a communication, to have a conversation with someone. And that is the most important thing. Is there anything else you'd like to add, or any other thoughts you want to mention?
I think something just sort of moving forward is thinking about creativity with students, because being aware that students are not, you expect the students to come in and be sort of much more tech savvy than you are. And I've been really interested to see how reticent they are sometimes to start to experiment creatively. And then once you give them the permission to be creative, and I spent part of a class throwing things at people on the screen. So I was sort of doing, and then they realized that they could then catch it. And then once we started doing that, that started to sort of free things up. And so actually having some fun with it, it feels, I was worried about how you would create a community and students becoming isolated. And actually there is a space to have some fun. And so doing some of those things actually opens things up. And once they realize that they can have some fun, it takes the fear out of it, and it lets us do what is best, what we do best, which is be creative.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. And again, this is an example of a conversation that probably wouldn't have happened if all of this hadn't, if we hadn't been in the pandemic. So I just wanted to, really appreciate your thoughts, and I hope we keep in touch.
Thank you. I'd love to.